Hi, and welcome back to the Geolytix podcast. My name's Ed Parsons. I'm here with some of the amazing Geolytix team talking about what they do and the impact, particularly of AI. We've spoken a little bit about data in the previous podcast. That raised all sorts of questions about how is this used? How can we trust and understand how AI systems are going to impact on our day-to-day lives? Here we have two experts from Geolytix on those very particular topics. Would you like to introduce yourselves, gents?
Yeah, so I'm Neil Farricker, so I'm founding director, but I also work as a head of security as well.
And I'm Sam Taylor. I am head of product at Geolytix. I've been at Geolytix for about 3 years now. Prior to that, I've been in product for about 10 years across a few different organizations. And at the beginning of my career, I was in location planning, which brings us onto the sort of topic of what Geolytix does and why I ended up kind of coming back to the world of location planning, but with a bit of a product management lens on it as well.
That's a really interesting perspective, Sam. So we've spoken in previous podcasts about what Geolytix does, the science of identifying locations for activities. You've been on both sides of that. You've been a customer and now, I guess, a supplier. Yeah. From that customer perspective, how important is trust? How important is that sense that you can rely on Geolytix as a company to actually use your data as part of the process?
Yeah, I think it's absolutely critical, to be honest. I mean, it's one of those things where if it's working well, you don't think about it at all. And I think when thinking back to my time as a sort of location planner and using the data, we had a great team around us in the company that I was working for. And there was very much that sense that people had eyes on the data at every given level. So we knew that the suppliers of the data were looking at it, trying to provide the best quality data possible, but then also we had internal checks. So before it even landed on my desk for me to use as a practitioner, I was fairly assured that it had gone through stage gate after stage gate to get to that point. And I guess the other great thing about working in that kind of client context as well was you get then a huge amount of the data. I was working for a retailer, get a huge amount of the retailer data as well. And you realize quite how messy that can be as well. So you get both sides of it, really. You kind of understand that data in itself is generally a bit of a mess and you can do with it what you like and you can tell stories with it. And I think that's one of the things that at Geolytix we really strive to do is making sure that data is robust and really trustworthy in itself. And I guess we'll come on to that in a bit.
Yeah. And Neil, I guess, part of the tenet of all of these sort of conversations we've been having is what you've been doing so far and the robust systems that have been put in place that Geolytix have been using for the last 20 years or so. Mm-hmm. And then how is that changing now in the age of AI? Could you give us some sense of what goes on behind the scenes? How do you make sure that the data is looked after, maintained, secure, all of those things that are really important? And if I'm a customer, how do I rely on you for doing that? What's the mechanisms in place?
Yeah, so we have an information management system policies basically. So anything to do with PII data, is personal identifiable information basically. Right. So talking things like names and addresses, email addresses, date of births, national insurance numbers, that kind of stuff. So when we receive data from a client, we do some semi-automatic aggregation or pseudo-anonymizations.
What you might perceive data to be, but actually by doing some manipulation of it, which you guys do, you can maybe change the characteristics of how we think about data.
Yeah. So all our systems basically have to be absolutely secured, and there's various different checks we go through, different policies. Data classifications, obviously the number one, the first protocol, and then there's the physical policies. So that would be things like locking down your PCs, making sure there's certain any data at rest is encrypted and all that kind of stuff really. And then there's obviously transfer between data, make sure that's fully secure. So it's got to be like TLS 1.3 plus and all that kind of getting very technical now, but but it's all that kind of policies that have to be set and tested and ultimately implemented. Yeah.
Right. So for your customers, and then I guess as a result of that, for the individuals that might be listening or watching this podcast, to the best of your ability and actually driven by legal requirements now, that data is securely managed, maintained. There are mechanisms in place to control that. So people should be reassured that is the case.
At Geolytix, definitely, yeah.
Yeah, and that's kind of been there forever and ever. That's been part of your kind of DNA, I guess.
Yeah, because ultimately, if there is a data breach, it's the end of the business for us. It is priority for us. Number one thing we consider every single project. It is just security straight away.
Right. And then I guess moving on from that, then you start to do analysis. Then you start to manipulate that data, carry out various modeling processes that we've spoken about previously with Blair in the first episode. How do you explain that to your customers, and how do you do that now in an increasingly complicated world with AI models?
Yeah, it used to be very easy.
Well, maybe not very easy.
No, maybe not very easy, but yeah, it used to be a lot simpler when you could just talk about R-squareds and percentage withins, and you could understand the model.
Okay, well, let's do 101. For those people that didn't do statistics, what's R-squared?
So it's just a measure of correlation, pretty much. So how well does it fit along a straight line is probably what I'd say correlation is. So it's basically modeled versus actual predictions, basically. Yeah. That's what you're measuring against. You're trying to model human behavior at the end of the day, and humans are quite random, unfortunately.
Well, maybe fortunately, who knows?
Oh, yeah.
I was just going to add, I think part of that process is sort of actually picking out the outliers from that data set, essentially, and being able to explain why that one probably does not quite fit the standard pattern, or what it is about that particular location, whether it's in our world, is it an off-site pitch, or is it something that's got limited visibility, or is there a reason that it's very hard to cross the road there, so although it looks busy, it's not. There's always a real-world reason that these things don't fit perfectly, right? And I think, on the topic today of sort of transparency and trust, like that is one of the things where people are used to picking these things apart, right? And being able to go, well, I see why you're saying that, and I can see why you're wrong on those ones as well.
Yeah,
I think that's such a crucial element to building that trust.
And I think that's a really interesting perspective, Sam, because as you said earlier, you were on the other side of the fence almost. You were the customer for these sort of location analytics. How important was it for you to be able to scratch at the model to actually understand what was going on and say, no, I don't agree with that, or yeah, that makes sense?
I probably shouldn't say this on a Geolytix podcast, because we used forecast models as like the basis for the work that we did, but I would say 7, 8, 9 times out of 10 I would change that. I would, as an analyst, I would go, that's interesting, I like your perspective, but I disagree for that particular village, town, whatever it would be. I don't think we're going to get the share there that we're predicting that we would. And so it will change the outcome of it. And, that was part of the work that I was paid to do ultimately, was to bring that level of understanding, common sense over the top of it. And so, yeah, of course the model says that, but no, it's never going to do that. But who knows how accurate I was as well. But that's the other challenge, isn't it?
But I guess you did that from a perspective of understanding how the model worked and understanding these were the inputs, and I can understand how you end up with the R-squared you get for whatever particular example. Now with AI, it's become a lot more complicated because there is clearly an issue with transparency. And would you like to expand? What is the transparency problem that we're kind of facing here?
I think ultimately, part of it is what question are you asking it, right? Like, I think there's different. If you're asking it some very simple, I use LLMs a lot, right? Every day I was trying to help my 10-year-old son with his maths homework the other day, and I've forgotten key maths principles, and I used an LLM because I knew that Googling it would take longer. So I just used an LLM and it gave me the answer straight away. There's really simple things which are easily verifiable, and I think that's where you can go, okay, it's relatively transparent. It's giving me some sources. If I really cared about, how to create angles in a triangle, shouldn't probably admit that was what I was struggling with. But for some things, yeah, absolutely. You don't need the transparency. You just go, yeah, that sounds pretty much right. But for other things, like you're chucking questions at a black box ultimately. And I think depending on how risky that question is or risky the outcomes of the answer to that question are, I think, Neil, you've got an interesting example when you...
with my cooking one.
Yeah, your cooking one.
Okay, let's hear this one, Neil.
Yeah, so basically my terrible cook, pretty much. So I was just basically trying to work out what's the safe temperature to cook a chicken at, and just entered that into Google. And it came up at like 62 degrees, and I thought, surely that doesn't sound right. That doesn't sound right, So I checked it up on the FSA, and it should have been like 72 or something or other. It's like, and the thing is, if you ask Google again the same question, it'll probably bring back the right answer or something a bit closer. So there's a question mark on the accuracy and repeatability of it as well, making sure that the same answers return.
Yeah, and we were having early on in the podcast series, we're having this discussion about the difference between a deterministic system, i.e. one that you put x plus y equals something, you'll understand what that is, and large language models as they are now are probabilistic. We're working on probabilities, and to a certain extent that's kind of understandable where you're looking at large language models and how they process text, and you can see that a large language model has been trained on all the text on the internet, and hopefully you'll get the right cooking temperature for a chicken. But it comes much more complicated, doesn't it, when we're talking about the realm that you guys are operating in, where it's not necessarily public text that's being analysed. You're not looking at relationships that are fundamentally about language. You're looking at relationships that are about geography. And we're going to come back at some point and talk about geographical foundation models. But it does represent this problem that I think we have, and that you guys are hinting at, that these are black boxes, that we don't necessarily know what's going on inside that box.
Yeah.
Is that a fair representation of things?
It is, because usually it's just one number that gets returned to us, which is normally the turnover of the store. That's the estimated turnover of the store. One number. How's it achieve that number? What we could do is probably a feature importance weighting and probably some kind of it's called SHAPS charts, where you can generally find out if a particular variable is adding a positive or a negative, and how strong that positive or negative is. There's other tests you can do. For instance, you could hold back test cases, and then bring back volumes of estimated turnovers for those test cases, and then work out which ones are contributing more than others.
Right.
And I guess Neil's talking about real life experience here as well. So, we use a lot of different modeling techniques. We pride ourselves on using the right technique for the right outcome at the time. So, we've got clients using machine learning models that have been built and tried and tested over the years. And we've had these conversations with them where they are coming back to us and saying, this is great. Love that I've got a number. Tell me how you got to that.
What does that number mean? Yeah. Yes.
And it's so hard to explain, as you said. There's because we don't often know entirely ourselves as well. We've put the inputs in, we put the logic there, but very hard to know what comes back. And AI is that on steroids, right? Like it's supercharging that, and it's answering those questions not just for what's the turnover of my store, but it's any number of other questions around as well. And I think the ultimate. We get asked quite often, is AI going to replace the role of a location planner? Can I just ask this LLM, should I put a store here? And it will say essentially yes or no with a bit of waffle around it. I think we're miles off there. Because I think one of the key things for our industry is these are not cheap decisions. These are really expensive decisions that are being made, right? I mean, my previous employer, they would spend £50 million building a new store. Not everybody has those expenses, but it's still, there's a huge amount of capital expenditure. You don't want to be the one that gets that wrong. So
Yeah.
And I think that's a really interesting dynamic. It's kind of one that I mentioned earlier, I think, in that there's this relationship between the ease of deploying an AI solution and then the ease of verifying the results of that AI solution. And what you're talking about is potentially something that's relatively easy to apply, but incredibly expensive to verify. If you, as you say, you make a mistake in a store location, that's millions of pounds. So I guess what you're saying is there is in location analytics, at least for the foreseeable future, there needs to be a human in the loop. There needs to be experience and that connection to real world experience as part of the process. Do you foresee that forever?
I don't know, honestly. I think probably not, because I look at the way that my use of AI is evolving. And if you'd asked me a year ago, I'd have said, absolutely, of course. The responses I get are junk. It's frequently more frustrating than it is helpful, all of these sorts of things. If I look at it now, I certainly still use it for sort of more creative endeavors because I think it's brilliant as a thought starter and as a shortcut for that. I still, if I'm being really lazy, will use it for sort of trying to find out factual answers to things. And I guess so for me, I think the way that the technology is evolving, the improvements you see with every model release and the competition between different companies that is driving that. I do think that at some stage there probably will become a tipping point where enough people are comfortable enough with the outputs that there doesn't necessarily always need to be a human in the loop. I was having a coffee before this and looked out the window and there was a Waymo driving past.
Yes.
They're training up in London right at the moment. And one of the things I just reflected on was these decisions, building new locations, building new stores are big decisions, but people trust their lives in Waymos, right? People are willing to take that risk-reward benefit. They obviously have a different perception of risk. Some people won't get in one. Some people absolutely will. They've seen crash videos where people have sadly lost their lives. There are some pretty compelling evidence out there why you would not trust a Waymo, why you would not trust that technology, and still people do. So I think there's an element where it's always going to be an uneven journey. Some people will trust things way quicker than others. It's probably a different adoption curve for certain people, right?
I think it's an interesting context, isn't it? Because in some ways you can look at AI as just another level of automation, and we automate most things. And I always used to, in some of the lectures I did, pick out the first building in Manhattan to have an elevator, and when it was installed, it suddenly allowed you to build skyscrapers. But the elevator had an operator, a man sat on a stool that would press the buttons to go between the different floors, and that's because people didn't trust elevators without having a human there operating them. Now it would be ludicrous to have a human operator to an elevator. We know that that's automated. I'm not convinced in the same way that you guys are, though. I think there is more craft, perhaps, to what you do than you appreciate. Maybe.
Oh, no. I mean, far be it from me to besmirch the craft of location planning, and I'm sure there's plenty of location planners that are probably heckling me right now. But I just see that trajectory. I'm not going to make a prediction in how long it will take, but certainly for okay, shall I do a refit? Okay, that's a cheaper decision. Ultimately, it comes down to where the risk reward is, and getting people to build bespoke models, sharing your data with companies to make that happen. There's some scary steps that people go through to engage with location planning. So I think, it's not.
I wanted to bring you in. There's another aspect to this, I guess, that we can't ignore, and that's around the regulations that we have to deal with as responsible custodians of data, responsible custodians of models. I guess there's a general understanding that regulation always is playing catch up to where the best practice is or where the cutting edge of technology is. Do you see that from your perspective? Are there regulations that are going to have to be implemented, or do you see where there's kind of gaps in where we are?
There definitely is. The questionnaires I get from clients, they've all started asking the AI questions now. So and that's only crept in probably the last 6 months, I think. So before that, there was no questions on AI, what you intend to do with it, or anything. No questions about that. Now there's questions on where is it stored? Are you training them? Is it a corporate account you're using? All those kinds of questions. So it's definitely changing.
Yeah, and I think there's a lot of complexity to unpick there, and particularly around data, IP rights, IP associated with models, all of that complexity that we could talk for the next 8 hours, but I promise we won't. Are there any things that we should have spoken about, any conversation topics around trust, transparency that we haven't covered that you think is important?
Who actually owns the inputs and who owns the outputs is quite critical. I think Google's opinion is that whoever's your inputs are owned by you and the outputs are owned by you. You just got to be on top of each, because each company is completely different as well. You just got to know the exact wording of their terms and conditions. It's quite a minefield, really.
And I guess it may be in terms of normal people listening to this podcast. What does that actually mean? So you're talking about, okay, I train a model based on some data. Clearly, I need to have some rights to use that data. Yep. You're saying that then the output of that data, who owns the output?
Exactly. Right. Yeah, exactly that. Yeah. So, I mean, the simplest case is it's something like a picture. It generates a picture. Who owns that picture? Is it Google? Is it yourself? Is it someone else? Or it's really, especially if you've got a third party involved, like a client. So if a client data gets uploaded to our Google system, for instance, then who owns that? Is it the client still? Is it Geolytix? Is it Google? And it's the client that still owns that. And the same with the output. The client will own that output as well, even though it will be our system that we'd use.
Yeah. And I guess as a context, you're building on such a complex series of different systems all operating on top of each other. It becomes really, really complicated.
It does. Yeah. Yeah.
But for your customers, don't worry. Geolytix is looking after that for you.
Yeah. Ultimately, they own everything. Yeah.
Very good.
Safe and secure. I guess the only other point that I would make is my, as an individual, my personal views on how comfortable I am with adopting technology or sharing data, or, whether I'm convinced or not by our security policies. We work with a lot of big corporates, and they tend to have a slightly more restrictive view than the individuals within those big corporates who we deal with as well. And so I think it's quite interesting in terms of when you start thinking about the adoption curve of these technologies, you tend to see that adoption happening much quicker within the individuals than you do with then maybe 3 or 4 year lag even before the company themselves gets comfortable with, okay, we can share our data with Geolytix in that way, or we could let them use it for that purpose. So we sort of operate in that tension between the two sometimes, I think.
Yeah.
Which I find a very interesting place to be. A lot of the time at the moment, we're getting asked to almost help these clients on that journey because we're smaller, we're more nimble, we're more able to adopt those sort of technologies. And we're almost sort of trying to be the ones that are showing people where this could go and how much they could trust this in the future. So it's an interesting dynamic to be sat in the middle of, I think.
But I think that's an interesting perspective. As we close out this conversation, I think we recognise we're all on a journey, aren't we? We're all learning how to use these new capabilities. What the impact AI has on your industry, on your business is we're all discovering, and you're taking part in that journey along with your customers. So I think that's a helpful perspective for people. We're all learning. No one has the answers, despite what they might say all of the time. We're all part of this learning process. Thanks, guys. I really appreciate your time today. I've learned a lot. I hopefully everyone's reassured that you guys are looking after their data. You're doing a good job of that and being as transparent and as secure as possible. Thank you very much.
Nice one. Thanks, Ed.
Cheers.